My name is Jocelyn King, and today I will be discussing my final project, which is an art piece that I have named What's Eating You? This art piece I believe to be a depiction of how Ryoko Kui uses her characters within her manga, Dungeon Meshi, to represent the cultural differences with food tastes and consumerism in our modern culture. Ryoko Kui's Dungeon Meshi is a manga that's often referred to as a manga about cooking, but the way that I like to think about it, and the way that many people view it when it comes to literary analysis, is as a manga about eating and consumption. While she does write her story as a fantasy and as a comedy, she also incorporates a lot of realism when it comes to the process of cooking, and allows readers to form these connections between the interactions with characters to the real-life circumstances that relate how we see food within differing cultures. When it comes to food, most people believe that what is edible and what is natural is obvious, but after taking this course, we know that's not true. What we think of as food is entirely based on our upbringing and our culture. Looking back to readings like the Sobo article on the sweetness of fat, we can see that things even as simple as eating habits and fat can be seen as entirely different things based upon the cultures that one is brought up in. In Ryoko Kui's manga, Marcel, which is one of the main characters that I'm going to be talking about, is depicted as a half-elf. She's thought to be from an entirely different culture than many of the characters in the book. Her species comes from an island separate from the mainland, and her background is often seen or described as being related to Italian, when the majority of the story takes place on an island that can be seen as or compared to Japan, mostly based on the commonplace dishes that are shown throughout the story. She's an extremely picky eater, with her favorite dish being described as spaghetti and meatballs, which is later misinterpreted as a ramen dish because of cultural assumptions from other characters. Throughout the series, Marcel is a main character that depicts the so-called abnormality of eating dungeon food. She's, from the very first moment that we're introduced to the problem, always turning her nose up at dishes that even include the slightest bit of ingredients having come from the dungeon. But her character is acting as the normal figure for our story, as eating dungeon food in this culture and in this story, in this world, is seen as completely taboo. It's not something that anyone thinks of. While other characters, such as the main character Laios, or side characters like Senshi, are intrigued or live off of the dungeon because of their own cultural backgrounds. This phenomenon that foods are gross or immoral, such as can be seen in our real cultures, like certain cultures eating things like dog, which is very taboo in our own culture, it's a big subject that's discussed throughout all of Ryoko Kui's manga. There are many creatures that live within the dungeon that are incorporated into meals that are often seen as inedible. One of the earliest examples of this is in one of the first chapters when the party uses herbs that had grown in a graveyard in their meal. Later on, there's a dish that they make that includes fishman eggs, which come from a humanoid monster, and both of these decisions create a massive argument between Marcel and the rest of the party due to the moral implications of eating such foods. While Marcel is seen throughout the story as this major opposing factor, with her fighting against certain morality choices when it comes to the dungeon food, she eventually and slowly comes to change her mind when it comes to these foods because of how Ryoko Kui uses her skills to make the process of cooking these dungeon meals into an extremely familiar process. She depicts characters as making dishes, including these unfamiliar ingredients, into processes and dishes that we know in our world. This kind of harkens back to how food psychology works, and through the cultures we grow up in depicting the foods that we know as edible. Babies aren't born knowing exactly what to eat and what not to eat, but it's rather something that they learn through observation of those around them. So using familiar processes like familiar dish names or cooking processes like frying or baking, she is able to make dishes that include ingredients from the dungeon like dried slime innards and walking mushrooms into delicious looking meals that can be named with commonplace terms like hot pots or tarts. We know from our lectures that familiarity is an extremely important piece of what we eat. A big example of this is the negativity surrounding GMOs, despite the good things that GMOs can bring when it comes to ease of farming and crop output, as well as making it so that crops aren't getting diseases as commonly. Most people don't understand or are familiar with what GMOs are, and therefore there's a massive negative connotation to any meal that includes ingredients with GMOs. And I like to relate these GMOs to dungeon ingredients, and how, because it's such an unfamiliar concept, people are against it. In moving forwards and past the topic of discomfort surrounding the unknown, we have the second major character that I plan on talking about, which is often playing a part alongside Marcel's character, and he's called the Winged Lion. Now, the Winged Lion is often seen as a godlike figure within this world, thought to be the creator of the dungeon that the party gets their meals from, and find themselves trapped within. It's to my belief that the Winged Lion can be interpreted as the symbolic representation of modern-day consumerism, and specifically that surrounding our grocery stores. This is because of what the Winged Lion represents within the story. He's not truly a godlike figure, but rather a demon. He feasts upon desires and is fully dependent on the wants and the so-called needs of what the other characters have. I relate this to the supermarkets, in what Pollen describes as the omnivore's dilemma. We think that we are making our own choices, but in reality, everything is already being done for us. We simply have the illusion of choice, and the same plays out for the Winged Lion, especially when it comes to Marcel, because Marcel wants suffering both in and out of the dungeon to end, and she certainly wants normal meals without dungeon ingredients, but these wants and options are put forth by the Winged Lion to appease her in return for consuming Marcel's desires, which is unbeknownst to her. This, I harken back to the transactional basis of how supermarkets function, in which we are put through the psychological processes of things like having milk at the back of the store, which encourages you to browse and look at all the things you could be buying, which influences us to give more than what's necessary to these large corporations. And that's kind of become this entire cultural norm within our society. Overall, I've simply grazed the surface of what Ryoka Kui has done within her story, relating cultural food interactions in our modern day world. I hope that I was able to bring to light some of the major topics that she speaks on within her manga, despite going a little bit over the time limit. But, thank you.